So let me, oh, one more minute. We are broadcasting. Yes, now we are online. Welcome back to the SNELA 2022. Speakers, guest lecturers, professors, and all the participants. Like the first round, I'll be bilingual throughout this keynote speech of Professor Kristiansen. That means first I'll be welcoming him in Turkish and then later on continue in English. Tekrar herkes hoş geldi. İkinci kısmına SNELA 2022 konferansının bu kısımda Profesör Kristian Kristiansen'in açılış konuşmasını dinleyeceğiz. Bir küçük aramız oldu zaman farkından dolayı. Hemen ben kısaca Profesör Kristiansen'i sizlere tanıtmak istiyorum. Kendisi 1994'ten beri İsveç Göteborg Üniversitesi Tarih Çalışmaları Profesörüdür ve 2020'den beri aynı zamanda Danimarka Kopenhagen Globe Enstitüsü Jeogenetik Merkezi'nde de çalışmalarını sürdürmektedir. Profesör Kristiansen kendisini geniş bakış açısına sahip interdisipliner bir araştırmacı olarak tanımlamaktadır. Kristiansen araştırmalarının bölgesel yerleşmelerin derinlemesine incelenmesine ve bilim insanları ile işbirliğini birleştirdiğini vurgulayan bir bilim insanı olarak 2011-2016 yılları arasında oldukça prestijli olan ERC Advanced projesi The Rise'ı yönetmiştir. Bu proje Kopenhag'dan Eske Willerslev ile genetik olarak Karin Frey ve Doug Price ile de ortak stronsiyum izotop çalışmalarının yürütülmesiyle sonlanmıştır. 2017-2022 arasında devam eden Yeni Bir Avrupa Prehistoryasına Doğru isimli ve İsveç Risk Bankası tarafından desteklenen projesinde bu çalışmalarını sürdürmektedir. Mayıs 2021'den itibaren yeni ERC Sinerji Projesi COREX kapsamında UCL ve Copenhagen Geogenetics işbirliği ile antik DNA verisinin büyük veri modelleriyle çalışılarak yerel ölçekte yansımaları üzerine çalışmalarını sürdürmektedir. Kariyeri boyunca arkeolojik mirasın korunması konusunda da çeşitli çalışmalarda bulunmuş olan Kristiansen son olarak Göteborg Üniversitesi'nde kurulan Kritik Miras Çalışmaları Merkezi'nin kurulması ve desteklenmesi üzerine çalışmalar yürütmektedir. Bu merkezin yöneticiliğini 2019 yılına kadar yürüten Kristiansen o zamandan bugüne kadar da merkezin müdür yardımcılığı görevini üstlenmiştir. Now I'm moving to English for a very short summary of your bibliography, Professor Kristiansen, who is a professor of archaeology and acts as the chair at the Department of Historical Studies, University of Gothenburg since 1994. And since 2020, he is affiliated as professor at Globe Institute, Long Beach Center of Geogenetics, Copenhagen University. Kristiansen defines his research as broad-minded and interdisciplinary. In his words, quote, his research combines grand narratives with depth studies of local settlements and collaboration with scientists. In his recent ERC Advanced grant, The Rise, geneticists like the Eske Willerslev team in Copenhagen, as well as scientists doing strontium isotopes like Karin Frey and Doug Price, collaborated. This project really led a rise, and Kristiansen's recent research named towards a new European prehistory funded by the Swedish Riksbank Foundation. Since May 2021, a new ERC Synergy grant from May called COREX from the same group emerged, which focuses on from correlations to explanations in collaboration with UCL and Geogenetics Copenhagen. The team combines big data modeling with in-depth local studies, including eDNA. Throughout his career, Kristiansen have also been engaged in various capacities in archaeological heritage, which most recently resulted in the formation and funding of a Center for Critical Heritage Studies at Gothenburg University. He was the director until 2019 and now assumes the role of the deputy director. Now, the floor is yours, Professor Kristiansen. Thank you for joining us today.
And thank you, Gonza, for this generous introduction of me. I will now try to share my screen to get started. Now the question is, no, that was, where is it? Share screen. That is here, share. Okay. And here. And now, are you, let's see, you see my screen?
Yes, we do.
And somehow I'm at the end here. You are screen sharing. Somehow I have to get back. Now, what do I do now? I have to
Maybe
get up.
Stop sharing screen and then open the first slide.
Okay, I'll do that. And let's know what did happen here. Stop sharing screen if I can find it.
You already did.
Okay, there we are. Okay, fine. Now we are ready to start for real. Thank you so much. And
we don't see your screen.
What I wish.
Share your screen. We don't see your presentation.
Oh, you don't see it. Okay. One more. Okay. No.
If you want, I can share it for you.
Can you share it for me?
Sure, definitely.
Because it seems to make some trouble for me right now.
Okay, I'll do it. Is it okay?
Yeah.
Okay. Whenever you tell me shift, I'll shift the slides.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you. Ready to go. So what I'm going to concentrate on today is really to try to move, to add volumes and numbers to the Bronze Age economies. I call it, you can also call it Bronze Age globalization in numbers. Next. And I'm going to take you through a number of parameters and types of evidence to understand how humans and things and animals moved during the Bronze Age, from approximately 2000 BC and down to 1000 BC, during a 1,000-year or a few hundred years period here. And first I will talk about the Bronze Age as globalization, then I will move to actual population numbers, then I will look into landscape changes and the formation of open landscapes and infrastructures. I will look into volumes of trade and its organization. And based on all this, I'll summarize Bronze Age economies. Next. Now, Helle Vandkilde, in a recent paper, defined the Bronze Age globalization of Eurasia, or Bronzization as she also calls it, as the period after 2000 when tin became universal, down to 1200 BC. And what she shows here is that he created a Bronze Age economy that spanned the whole Eurasian continent. And we see some centers here of state formation and heavy consumption. But we also see that the basic commodity tin can only be mined in a few places, and therefore had to travel long distances to get to everywhere on this huge continent. So we have to ask, what were the quantities that were traded in this system? How did it happen? Who were the travelers? And to illuminate this, I will take a look at the western part of the system. Next. Let's begin with demography. Now, here is a graph that was created some years ago by Johannes Müller, where he, based on a lot of different publications, tried to estimate the real numbers. The two interesting figures you see here is the one for the Near East, and it goes from right to left, and the one from Europe. And what you see is that to the left they cross each other. So between 2000 BC and 1400 BC, the period we are going to deal with here, Europe see an incredible demographic expansion at a time when apparently there is some recession or decline in the Near East. But the point here is, in absolute numbers, the Near East and Europe at that time would have more or less similar numbers of people, around 13 million people, 12, 13 million people according to this graph. The main difference would be that more of them would be concentrated in city-states, in cities in the Near East, and they would be more decentralized in Europe. How could that happen? There was this huge demographic expansion. Well, we have a new wool economy. Wool will only start to become in common use after 2000 BC in Europe. Healthier dress, new food treatment, salting and smoking of meat, and the new metal economy created permanent regular connectivity and put demands on infrastructure and political systems. So the point I already wish to announce here, I want to announce here is that basically speaking, a new modern political economy starts after 2000 BC in Europe. And it's less peripheral than we have normally been used to think of in relation to the Mediterranean and the Near East. Next. Therefore, let us begin here in the Near East and Central Asia and the trade system, because that's when globalization really speeded up. What we see here is a chariot horizon between 2800 BC and how it interacted with Bronze Age states to the south. I've shown here Kanish, something I will come back to, and some of the trade routes here that connected these areas. Next. So this was also, the chariot expansion was not only a technological expansion, it was also the expansion and rapid dominance of the modern horse. We learn now from the recent work and publication in Nature. And it also led to a trade in both horses and horse trainers throughout the known world. So animals were also traded from this time period onwards. And a new weapon technology and a new form of warfare speeded up things immensely and allowed new types of new, more hierarchical political economies to dominate. Next. So all of these areas from Central Asia and the steppe to Greece and Anatolia, they share the royal elite style linked to chariots and horses. And they also were interconnected through trade in metal and woolen textiles. So huge regions were interacting and had shared cultures. This was when the Minoans formed the East Mediterranean Sea Trade Empire, and tin was traded from the east in Kazakhstan, Afghanistan to Assur, and further to Kultepe or Kanish in Anatolia. Next. So, of course, let's start from the known and then move to the more unknown. Because in the old Assyrian trade system, we have one of the best documented cases for the extent and of traded goods, and also its physical extension and its integration into a global West Asian trade system, as I have tried to show here with these two slides. First, we see the internal trade lines, well documented in the letters, in the archives, and to the right, the various trade circuits, which we may assume were very similar to the one documented in Canis, but without similar documentation. Next. So here are some minimum figures for this 30-year period covered by the Canis archives around 1880. So households in the Near East were completely based on bronze kitchenware and also in the farming economies. So what we see here is 110 ton of tin, 4 ton per year, which will produce 40 ton of bronze implements per year. And tin arrived apparently into Assur from Central Asia. We also have documented 150,000 fine textiles of many kinds. And also the Assyrian traders had internal regional trade in Anatolia. Mentioned one big operation, mentioned 24 ton, where copper was exchanged for wool and wool was to silver, the currency. An individual household in Canis would have around 50 to 75 kilos of kitchenware. And with an estimated population around 20,000, perhaps 1,000 households, it meant 50 ton of bronze. And if we add city-states up, we end in huge annual demands for bronze that had to be replaced. 50 ton is one load of the Ulaburan shipwreck. There must have been dozens of annual shipments like that during the Bronze Age. Next. So, such a system demanded a highly developed infrastructure to function. And again, we can take inspiration from the old Assyrian documents. Here we are talking about inland donkey caravans, and 500 donkeys for a big caravan would need 8 tons of water per day and 3 kilos of food daily. So a whole system of inns took care of feeding the animals and humans along the 1,000-kilometer route. And services were paid for in cash metal, and guards and guard posts were located at the bridges and along the route for protection. So societies were transformed and geared to carry and support this new infrastructure that also included a postal system for letters, a banking system for loans, and so on and so forth, and extensive knowledge, of course, of faraway places. And political agreements was part of this infrastructure. And what I suggest here is that we can take inspiration from this and ask ourselves, how much of that was needed when we moved to the Mediterranean and further on to Central and Northern Europe? And I'll come back to that in some minutes, where we have no written sources, but we have rich archaeological sources who will provide a different type of evidence. Next. So this system was in operation for some generations, but after 1700 around, there is a shift in international trade from eastern sources of tin and copper to western sources. It's already suggested that in a tablet that copper now started to come from Alaska, Cyprus. The Dilmun trade collapses, and copper from Oman and tin sources from the east dry up. And this is when exploration starts to get new sources in the Mediterranean, and when Crete is at its height to importing copper from Lavrion. And we see new explorations into the Western Mediterranean via Sicily and France, leading on to Cornwall and Wessex, which exported tin and amber from Scandinavia back to the Mediterranean. So a new international network was created in a few generations around this time. Next. And this system, which I have sort of illustrated here in the figure here to the left, we see this Mediterranean system with new settlements in southern Italy and reaching even to Sardinia and over to Wessex in the earlier periods, and after 1600 more geared towards Central Europe and Northern Europe, they were incorporated. And amber from Scandinavia were now reaching the East Mediterranean and Central and East Mediterranean. Mesopotamian glass reached Scandinavia in some quantities, as well as Mediterranean culture setups, camp stools. And now we see the introduction and expansion of woolen dress and new warrior cultures. And this is when we see the full extension and the full integration of Europe into the global Bronze Age world system, as it were. And I will come back to the kind of infrastructure, political and economically, in a moment. Next. This is also when we see how, with that integration into this Bronze Age trade system, we also see the introduction of weights and balance weights. And you can start breaking things up into smaller pieces and weight them, as we see here on this map from the project of Lawrence Ramstorff. So this is fundamentally important and new evidence here, supporting this integration of the trade systems. Next. This is also when we can document the large-scale mining operation now being in place, not only for copper and tin, but also for salt. The salt mines here from Hallstatt had their high point during the Middle Bronze Age. As we see this reconstruction here, producing salted and smoked bacon that could be exported and be used on the long trading expeditions, whether at land or at sea. Next. And this is also when we see a regional division of labor in Europe take place, where each region had something that other regions needed. Tin from Cornwall, amber from Scandinavia, silver from the Carpathians, copper from the Alps, etc., etc. And remember, with a population around 13 million people, many landscapes had reached their carrying capacity, and to a degree that would not be exceeded until the modern age. So commercial trade systems were needed to supply these rising populations, not only with metal and woolen textiles, but also with salt and in some regions good building timber. We now see regions that are totally deforested and had to import timber. A real economic division of labor had emerged, correspond to Ricardo's comparative advantage was now in operation. Next. And this is also what we can see in modern point diagrams when we calibrate them to with reveals to absolute numbers and real landscapes. You see to the left a traditional point diagram, and then the calibration. Now you get the real figures, and you'll see how this area, northwestern Jutland in Denmark, is totally deforested, and by the Bronze Age, there are virtually no trees left in this area. They had to import timber, and this is when you have a population peak, as we can see here to the right in the graph of C14 days, but also in the number of wealthy burials. So the historical open landscapes of Europe were really created in the Middle Bronze Age, and continued, especially when you are in northwestern Europe with the western winds. Forest would never regenerate. Next. And here we see from the databases, European databases of these pollen diagrams, you can make these broad time slices where you see how the forest is retreating from the 5th, 4th millennium. And once you read into the Bronze Age, 1000 BC, you will see how Denmark and Northern Europe here is, especially the northwest, is more or less becoming treeless. We have the formation of the open, densely settled landscapes that would continue into historic times. Next. And this is the landscape as it looked like, with huge, individual farmsteads and hamlets, many of them quite impressive and big, several hundred square meters, where you could also have cattle stalled in some of them, and slaves as well, and tens of thousands of barrows were built along the routes or routes where the caravans would travel. 50,000 barrows alone in Denmark, of a small area of 44,000 square meters. Next. In the same way we see in the south, once we get south of the Alps or into southeastern Europe and the Balkans, we see rather bigger communities, tell settlements or terra mare here in northern Italy, highly organized and completely cultivated landscapes, well drained with canals, a highly sophisticated farming infrastructure was in operation here during these centuries of the Middle and Late Bronze Age. Next. So let's have a look now at volumes and organization of trade. Next. So I've chosen here to look into Denmark because we have such high resolution and data. And we can say with certainty that there were minimum 25,000 farms in the Middle Bronze Age, Late Bronze Age in Denmark. And they would have both axes and other bronzes, each of them. So it makes, the household would be around 10, 15 people for each farm. So we have a population here of around 300,000 people. And we have an annual minimum stock of bronze of 20 metric ton and a replacement of 1 to 2 ton annually. And also we can see that let's say if the free part of the population, which would be like 50,000 people, would have woolen dress as we know it from the oak coffins, and then if 2 big pieces of cloth, which we know of from the burials, 2.3 meter, 2 times 3 meter, well, you would have an annual import to maintain that of 4,000 pieces of cloth per year. Next. So we are talking here about substantial numbers for this little, small, but still wealthy region. And also, if each household provided 1 warrior with 2 lances, or even 1 lance, that would make between 20 and 40,000 lances in circulation, and several thousand swords. And if we apply that to Europe, we are talking about hundreds of thousands of warriors, armed warriors. Now, before I will sort of extrapolate these figures to Europe, I want to take you on a small journey. I want to trace or follow a single warrior who traveled a long distance before he settled and died and were buried in northwestern Jutland in Thy. Next. He was buried around 1300 with a, or 1250 with a imported or foreign sword, not a Nordic sword, but a Riksheim sword from Switzerland, northeast France. We then looked into his skeleton and took strontium isotopes, and we could demonstrate that he was a non-local. He had an origin from a mountainous region outside Denmark and outside Scandinavia. Most likely then, next, most likely then he would have traveled with his sword from this region in the northern Alps, along the Rhine, up to, with one of the caravans, up to Denmark and northwestern Jutland. Next. And when we look at the composition of his sword, and here we have plotted Scandinavian and German swords against major ore regions, mining regions, Mitterberg, Slovakia, Italian Alps. This sword from Jestro plots with Italian ores, Trentino, Bolzano. And if you look to the right and look at the color of the dots, you'll see that most Scandinavian and German swords from this period of the Middle Bronze Age, as we define it here, their copper originate in the Italian Alps. So this was a global mining operation exporting copper to large parts of Europe during these few hundred years. A few ones were also coming, a few swords would also have its copper from Mitterberg or Slovakia, but they were at this time a minority. The Italian Alps was the main supplier throughout Europe, also to England. At this time we know and can document. Huge mining operations. Next. So what we can do here, we can reconstruct a triangular trade system that connected northwestern and central Europe, and each of them had something the other needed. Copper was exported north, where you would add tin from Cornwall, and amber would go south from Denmark in exchange for the copper. And this trade system would then link up south of the Italian Alps with the Mediterranean trade system. And that would distribute the amber further down to Greece and Syria and the East Mediterranean. And you would have Mesopotamian and Egyptian glass and other things moving up north along the same circuit of trade. Next. But not only metal was moving. Woolen textiles we have now documented from Danish oak carving with these extreme well-preserved textiles. They are predominantly of non-local origin. They were not able yet to produce wool locally in Northern Europe. The woolen sheep had not reached, and first of all, the political economy in Northern Europe was not yet geared to this. So all woolen textiles were imported from Central Europe, or even further south, as you see to the right here. Next. And we believe that the wool production, and there was both wool production and trade in yarn and cloth. And we have been able to show also in northern Italy there was sites specialized for one step in the production process. At Montale, Po Delta, thousands of spinning wheels were found on one site. They were specialized just doing that. And you could trade both the yarn, but especially you would trade the cloth as sort of prefabricated 2 times 3 meter worth as a typical export cloth. Next. And here in the Po Valley that we return to, you have this wool economy flourishing during this period. Next. The Danish wool originates from many different mountain areas in Central Europe, but some may also originate from the Termar culture, which has a signature consistent with that of the Danish find, a lowland signature. So those 20% of the Danish wools that look Danish could just as well come from northern Italy. And here you can see to the right that they had really specialized in sheep breeding and in the wool economy. And the same we have been able to demonstrate in Hungary at the tell sites there. Next. And now you may ask, what were the goods that South Scandinavia provided in exchange for metal? Because at this time, South Scandinavia probably, when we look at the wealth in burials and hoards, there is no other region in Europe that matches South Scandinavia in richness and in the amount of gold as well, and in the high class craft, metal craft. And we found, we excavated the house 1 kilometer from the west coast of Jutland, and from this period, and buried under the floor, we found such a catch of raw amber waiting for a trader to pass by. So obviously Baltic or Danish amber was exported to the south, and it had the worth of gold, we tend to think, at least when you compare with the Roman times and extrapolate backwards in time. And we can also say that even if this is a black economy, like truffle seeking is a black economy, we interviewed people, and a good amber collector who knows his beaches and goes after the right storm, if he has a lucky week after a storm, he can collect, or she can collect, up to 1 to 2 kilos of amber, raw amber. If you have 100 collectors along the west coast of Jutland, you can easily collect 100, 200 kilos of amber during a season. So we have to imagine that what we find in the graves is just the smallest tip of an iceberg. Next. But we also believe that captives, perhaps it's premature to call them slaves in the sense that we do not know if there was a real commercialized slave trade further south as later, but at least it's very clear that you had a large group of unfree people that we have documented in other ways that I cannot go into details about here. But we found this rock carving up from western Norway that to me suggests that this was a slave train led by this warrior with the sword, and these unarmed people, some of them roped together, were captives that would become labor when taken south and maybe sold further on to Central Europe or even further. And also Bohuslän would have timber and shipbuilding. So we have a really economic division of labor and a large group of unfree that also was part of the economy quite clearly. Next. So here I have summarized who were the travelers and their institutions during the second millennium BC in temperate Europe. So the travelers were warriors protecting the caravans or the ship, and there were traders, or they could be one and the same. and they were linked together in kin groups. They were raiding and they were protecting. And the social institutions supporting them would be, on the one hand, warrior sodalities, then there would be guest friendships and trade partners, and that would be supported by marriage alliances spanning many, many hundred kilometers, which I will show in a moment. So what we have here to forge or link together these long lines of trade that would allow a warrior from the Alps to travel to Jutland were political confederations. A confederation would typically be more than 500 kilometer, or not less than 500 kilometer, up to 500 kilometer, maybe more. The typical distances covered by traders would be 150 to 500 kilometers, and the kin groups or the kingdoms or chiefdoms would be between 50 and 150 kilometers. Next. So these networks we can now document archaeologically through highly specialized studies of bronze work and especially of ornaments. And we can identify the movement of such ornaments and the women carrying them, being buried outside their home region where they were produced. And they are typically marrying between kingdoms or chiefdoms. So together that formed from the Alps to Denmark, you see this political confederations of allied, in-married chiefdoms making possible a trade infrastructure to operate rather peacefully, it seems, between 1500 and 1300 BC. After that, it would change, go more towards East Central Europe, or along the west coast and down to Spain. So we have these confederations, and inside those we have chiefly workshops, and then we have the trade hubs, several of these in each of these chiefdoms along the way that would correspond to the inns in Anatolia and the Near East, and where guest friendship would take care of the traders. Next. And these are the main routes. We believe that a lot of this trade was seaborne. Scandinavians were specialists in building ships and in sailing the coast of Scandinavia, which would allow them, for them, going down here to the Weser around would be a small trip compared to the trips they would take up to Norway and up along the coast of Sweden and Norway, which would be much longer distances, in fact. And these are also potential slave corridors, as we see it. And what we have marked here is the three main mining areas of this period, where the Italian Alps would be the dominant mine during this period, providing the whole region with its copper. A huge operation. Next. And here we have another map showing the Scandinavian or the Baltic amber on its way south and being here found in rich burials of the Middle Bronze Age tumulus culture here in Central Europe. All of it coming from Denmark. And we believe trades were part of that network. Next. So again, back to quantities. Now it's time to extrapolate the evidence from Denmark to what it amounts to when we look at the whole Western, the whole of Europe here. Next. Because if we extrapolate those figures from Denmark to Europe, And if we stopped, and we have a Europe of 10 million square kilometers, but let's exclude a lot of the forested regions of Scandinavia and northern Russia. Let's just assume 3 million square kilometers that were densely settled. 10 people per square kilometer makes 30 million people. Johannes Müller calculated 13 million, but did not include Russia. It suggests that these figures are realistic minimum figures. And they represent 3 million households that needed bronze on a daily for their daily subsistence. Which makes, if we say there is a replacement rate of 5%, that would demand 3,000 ton replacement per year. This is a model, but it's anchored or founded in extrapolations from the rather well-documented case of Denmark to the less documented case of Europe. But I hope it can serve as an inspiration to other colleagues to carry on this and either criticize or come up with new evidence. Next. Now, we also know that huge mining operations were needed to cover this globalized supply, and that we can document. As I said, lead isotopes demonstrate that nearly all copper in Europe came from 2 or 3 operating mines during this period. And when one mine was exhausted, another would take over. For instance, Kargil in the Urals produced an estimated 150,000 tons of copper during the Bronze Age, extracted from 2 to 2.5 million tons of copper ore. And 2/3 of this production, 100,000 tons, took place during our period, 1700 to 1400 BC. Next. So, the Bronze Age saw the rise and decline of competing trade routes, but only by the later Bronze Age, after, let's say, 1100-1200, that's what we call late in temperate Europe, did it become possible to link the whole Atlantic network from north to south. And I have just shown you here some distances that had to be covered. Because in Scandinavia we have 10,000 of ships carved on rock art along the coasts of Norway and Sweden. So sea people or seamen were traveling on sea journeys, linking together the whole Scandinavian coastal region. And this is several thousand kilometers, as you can see. So for a Scandinavian ship, it wouldn't be difficult to turn the boat around, and instead of going north, they would go south, and they would easily come down to France or the British Channel without problems, with all the experience from the long sea journeys they had, where they were used to going north in Scandinavia. So after all, even if it may look impressive to think of, it is, when you look at it from the point of view of professional seafarers, highly trained, we have a whole new maritime economy emerging here during the 2nd millennium BC. It's not surprising that they could do these travels down to France, Spain, Central Europe along the rivers and reach the Mediterranean. Not at all surprising. And carry substantial bulk of goods in their ships. Next. So what we see here is a development of real commercialized or commercial commodity trade, highly organized infrastructures, highly organized and complex political economies, chiefdoms or archaic states that could communicate with the city-states in the Mediterranean and the Near East without problems. And these, on the other hand, were depending on supplies of raw materials from these regions, whether silver or tin or amber or perhaps even slaves. Next. So what we see here is it's an integrated yet diversified world that emerged in the second millennium BC. Well, in the Near East and the East Mediterranean, population figures were higher because you had urban populations there that boosted consumption. And you had a full metal economy, both in all bronze tools and in kitchenware. You had still use of stone and bone in the rest of Europe, at least to some extent. But still, even here, hundreds or rather thousands of tons of copper was traded annually, and probably up to 100-ton tin as well. So what I suggest here is that a modern economy, in the sense of at least a pre-modern economy, emerged that supported advanced commercial trade system. And Europe was integrated in this Bronze Age globalization as a supply of high-value goods, warriors and perhaps slaves. And all communities were depending on bronze. Every farm needed it, even if consumption of metal was lower in Europe than in the Near East. Yet a commodity-based metal trade developed, based on regular trade caravans and shipments, much supported by an infrastructure which had many similarities, I would suggest, to the one we know so well from Anatolia and from Kaunas. And this infrastructure distributed hundreds or rather thousands of tons of copper annually, as well as tens of thousands of pieces of cloth. Next. So a pre-modern economy of commodity trade emerged from the Middle Bronze Age onwards and created the first globalization in world history that lasted a little more than 1,000 years. And I would suggest that later developments are rather changes in scale than changes in organization. So to put it, in simple terms, the main difference between the Viking world and the Bronze Age world was the geographical scale of colonization. The political economy was basically similar. So my proposal is that the basic institutions of the modern world were created during the Bronze Age. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Kristiansen. That is such a lovely and broad prospect from the European side. And the first part, Professor Decksen kindly overview of all the philological evidence from the Near East. Now we have the opportunity to connect it to the Europe and see how globalized really the Bronze Age economy is. Actually, I have one question when you put all these like copper, tin, timber, and salt circulation around Europe, and it somehow connects to the Eastern Mediterranean, right? To the Cyprus and the Aegean, maybe probably to Anatolia as well. So what would be the payback of Anatolia? Could it be somehow silver or wool? Or do you have any archaeological evidence from Europe that we missed?
Yeah, the thing is that in Anatolia you have these wonderful archives. They're unique, and of course you also have wonderful archaeological evidence. But the main difference between the political economy in Europe and in Anatolia or the Near East is that in the Near East you invest and you invest in infrastructures and roads and bridges and temples and things like that, you don't, and you remelt your metal to make good use of it. You don't waste it in hoarding it or putting lots of it in burials, only a few selected ones. In Europe, you just squander your metal in thousands of burials. You put swords in burials, thousands of swords. You put them in. You hoard them. You do this. And so you consume a lot. So we know a lot more actually in Europe about the metal and craft and the metal economy in some ways than we do in the Near East. In the Near East, we know a lot more through the written sources about the actual organization of society. And then we have these wonderful pollen diagrams from temperate Europe that allow us a real reconstruction of the environment, where we can show that the historical landscapes emerged during the Middle Bronze Age.
Thanks a lot. I think Linda has a question.
Yes, I do. It's probably a little bit late for the period of study that Professor Kristiansen's worked on, but I'm curious about whether there was an impact of the Bronze Age collapse in Northern Europe. We know it had horrific consequences in the Eastern Mediterranean, but we have no idea how far those effects extended. And of course, it affected the trade routes and movement of people at the same time. Roughly 1200 BC. So do you get any impact of that?
You know, the interesting thing here is that we don't see any collapse in Central or Northern Europe at that time. We see continuation. We see some movements, yes. We have a big battle up in Mecklenburg in Tollense taking place around 1250, but that's a little before. But you know, we have one big thing happening. So on the whole, there is continuation, but of course there are local disruption here and there, as you always find it, but nothing compared to the really 1200 BC collapse. What we see though is that the huge, highly organized Terra Mare settlement, as I showed you, that they break up. There's a huge exodus out of the Po Delta after around 1200. Within a very short period of time, they desert most of their settlements. Some move down into other places in Italy, but others move evidently on ships further into the Mediterranean. And I do believe that a lot of the Italian ware we find in the East Mediterranean would originate from here. Mm-hmm. This is huge exodus, and they have calculated that there lived around 300,000 people in the Po Delta at this time. And the Po Delta is not fully populated and settled again until several hundred years later. Of course, you have Fradecina and other places that still keeps operating. You have the fringes of the Alps still keeping operating. But there's a huge exodus going on this time. So, I mean, the sea peoples have to come from somewhere, right?
Right.
Here you have one possible source, I say, possible source.
And it may have been the same environmental factors that were affecting us in the Eastern Mediterranean, because it clearly was environmental.
Yeah, I mean, we have this big environmental change. We have this it's become warmer, and we can see in the Po Delta that the groundwater sinks several meters, it seems. You know, so there is something really seriously going on.
Interesting.
Sure.
Good. Thank you. So that was still within our shadow.
So Bülent raised hand.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Professor Kristiansen. This was really a fantastic overview that allowed us to draw a lot of parallels or comparisons between the regions. Just a quick question, sort of a follow-up from what Linda brought up. Do you think that this collapse, and not to say collapse, but this change rather from centralization to maybe decentralization, do you think this was do you think this also had an economy aspect? I was thinking of maybe they could not really getting enough out of their technology. Maybe they reached some sort of like a glass ceiling in terms of their technological infrastructure that they could not really get, or they couldn't really find enough raw materials for their production, and coupled with the environmental change, probably anthropogenic.
Are you still talking about 1200?
Yes.
Well, I mean, that's a very good question, obviously. Now, tin was, of course, a constant worry. And we can see the Minoans, for instance, once they get access to tin from the Western Mediterranean, the tin content goes up in the bronzes. 1200 BC, if they had reached the ceiling of their technology, I'm not so sure, because because apparently everything was operating quite fine as far as I can see. At least in Europe, everything was operating quite fine. There were, and I mean, a well-executed sword where you hammer the edges. I guess it's nearly just as efficient an iron sword. I'm not a specialist in this, but so I'm not sure if that hit the ceiling. I think there are other causes that may be more important. We also know, of course, that the plague was very old. I mean, we know the plague now goes 5,000 years back. Plague could also be part of it. And but you know, cause and effect again. What came first, the sea peoples and the migrations, or the collapse? Obviously, people move in when something collapsed, right? Or did they cause a collapse?
Mm-hmm.
There's always this cause and effect thing.
Right.
What came first?
Right. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. One last question from me before we finish. This probably will pull Professor Decksen also into the discussion, since Professor Kristiansen mentioned that this Bronze Age economy, or late Bronze Age, what we call it in terms of chronology of Anatolia, economy is the pillar of the modern economy. Do you think that Middle Bronze Age economy, this like Assyrian trading system, could have been acted as a role model for the European trading system?
My short answer is certainly.
Yes, I agree. Yes. Yeah, different stages, it must have been known how such systems worked and people got influenced. But may I take this opportunity to ask Professor Kristiansen something about the use of bronze in households in Europe? You looked at the comparative material from Kultep, where we have a few texts that enumerate the kitchen utensils in bronze. So we have, what is it, 50 kilos in a few households. But these only apply to Assyrian households. Yes. I'm not aware how the archaeology is in Bronze Age Europe, but is it not possible that some of the households there would have pottery used for?
Oh, of course. I mean, yeah. But you know, the thing is that they used pottery, especially in parts of Central Europe. They had highly advanced pottery, yes. But I'm thinking in terms of metal. I mean, metal bowls, metal this, metal that, tripods, whatever. You didn't have that up in Central and Northern Europe. You would have wooden bowls. They had a rich tradition in carving wonderful wooden bowls. And then some of the Danish wooden bowls that were in these oak coffin burials, they would be decorated with tin sprags. You know, hundreds of small tin nails. Which shows also that they had the raw tin. And the other, they would still make sickles of flint. They would also make bronze seals, but it would vary between regions, how wealthy they were, how much access they had to bronze, how much. Over time, the amount, the number of bronze seals would go up. But it's not, I cannot really say that the way you have all these farming tools in Anatolia and the Near East of bronze, I cannot say you had that to the same extent of the North.
Oh.
So in that sense, it's a more full Bronze Age economy. There's been some interesting studies, though, by Arek Marciniak and his colleagues who have studied butchering and butchering marks, and you can distinguish and you can see when they use metal or bronze knives or tools and axes for the butchering, and that increases over time also in Europe. So there's, and all axes, of course, were bronze. All types of axes, small and big, and so on. So yes, they were fully integrated in the metal economy, but it hadn't penetrated out into the kitchen as much as in Kultepe.
Okay, thank you.
Then thank you a lot, and I'll take the opportunity to thank all the organizers and keynote speakers for the opening of SNELA 2022. So I believe all these discussions will cast a very nice pillar for the upcoming talks in the next 2 days. And thank you very much for joining us. Hopefully see you in Istanbul physically next time.
Yes. Absolutely.
Thank you. Yeah.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.